be agreed to.
Mr.
The
Speaker.
Honourable David Parker.
Mr. Speaker, there are children at school who were not born when this bill was first introduced into this House. I know that because I was the Minister at the time in 2008 when it was introduced, and that's now 8 years ago, or 7 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago since this was introduced. Yeah, I feel a bit older myself actually, and I have to go back through the records to remember some of the detail of this. Some of the details I do remember, and the reasons why the Labour Party is supporting this bill, but it does actually have to be pointed out that delays of this year, of this number of years, actually serve no one's interests. It increases the cost of these processes because everyone looks at it and then looks at it again and looks at it again and looks at it again. Parliament ends up having a number of goes at it, and people who are interested in the issues that are at large underneath the bill are dragged back into their archives year after year thinking, where's that happening? I know in respect of one of the matters affected by this bill, which relates to Taieri Airport, that every time I run into Julian Smith, who's one of the owners of the Otago Daily Times, he asked me, where's that provision in the Reserves and Other Land Disposal Bill that's meant to be clarifying the status of the Taieri Airport? And that's important to them because they're worried that the government's going to that their status is uncertain and that they could actually lose their rights to run the airport. So that's one example which has caused inconvenience to people. Another one that's more serious down my way, where the losses have actually been caused to one of the district councils that amount to millions of dollars, actually relates to an issue in Jackie Dean's electorate in Oamaru. In the Reserves and Other Land Disposals Bill, it was clarified that the land on that overlooks the town, which is called Lookout Point in the original version of this legislation, which was perhaps a misnaming. But anyway, that area of land was originally given to the predecessor of the Waitaki District Council as endowment land. But at some point in the process, way back when, it was described as reserve land. And therefore there was controversy as to whether the council could sell that land and realise its worth. The council wanted to, and indeed needed to, sell that land because they wanted to realise the money from that land to pay for other important works by the district council, including the building or the rebuilding of the Opera House in Oamaru, which cost some millions of dollars. They entered into contracts for the sale of sections on this piece of land, which is called Forrester Heights, I think is the proper name, and those contracts were all subject to the legal clarification of this point, which was necessary in order for them to complete the subdivision. Because Parliament has delayed so long in this, all of those contracts reached the expiration date, by which time property prices in Oamaru had dropped, and none of those contracts confirmed. They all fell over, and the Waitaki District Council, as a consequence, lost millions of dollars. That's the consequence of this sort of delay and what seems as somewhat mundane legislation. So I think that's probably the worst instance here. In fact, it was so bad that Jackie Dean, at the request of her council, sponsored a local bill to give effect to the provision that was in the original Reserves and Other Land Disposal Bill, and this Parliament passed the separate bill, the local bill. Now that again caused waste. It cost money because the local bill costs the council money to promote, not just their own legal fees, but they've actually got to pay a fee to Parliament to introduce. They've also got to pay money to Parliament to introduce a local bill. Then the time of this House was set aside for considering that local bill instead of other matters, and none of that would have been necessary if this bill had just been advanced perhaps half a decade earlier. It might seem unreasonable that this bill could, sorry, I shouldn't say that. It is entirely reasonable expectation on the part of the people around New Zealand whose interests are affected by this bill that it was dealt with promptly, and unfortunately it hasn't been. Mr. Speaker, the matter relating to the Auckland Art Gallery, thank the Minister for that description. Again, that was a little bit controversial for some who saw the expansion of the art gallery as some improper extension into the adjacent Albert Park in Auckland. Again, as the Minister has clarified, the contention around this bill was misplaced, as evidenced by the fact that they could do it even without this bill being passed. So sometimes people claim controversy when they disagree with something, even when legally it is not controversial. So the matters in this bill that are being addressed are not legally controversial. They fix often misdescriptions of property that have occurred in parts of New Zealand over a period of time, and as a consequence it's common for every 5 years or so for a reserves and other lands disposal bill to be introduced into this House. The Select Committee did remove provisions that they didn't think were appropriately timed in respect of Auckland volcanic cones. I'm sure my colleague Phil Goff will mention that in his contribution. Otherwise, sir, this bill is relatively uncontroversial. One final thing in respect of the Taieri Airport. I raised with the then Minister of Lands recently why it was that in order to get this clarification as to status of the Taieri Airport land, it was necessary for the Crown to say that in the event that that land's ever sold, they get half of the proceeds of sale. I've never understood the theory for that. The Minister was going to look into it. I haven't heard where that's ended, and I'm afraid therefore that the provisions as they stand in the bill will not fix that defect. Having said that, the Taieri Airport, although they would have preferred otherwise, more importantly want the legislation to go through, even if it has that provision which is not to their ideal liking. Mr. Speaker, I recommend this bill to be passed by the House.